Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the Gloomhaven of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka Nurgle. No, not that Nurgle, the Nurgle from Warhammer 40k Nurgle.
Oh, hell yeah. Okay, and I am the black metal guy, aka Midnight Raccoon.
I have to deal with those all the time.
Yeah.
My apartment building... Well, I'm right up against the woods in my apartment building, and we've got like a valet trash service, and there's a window of maybe 20 minutes where I can put my trash out before the raccoons get into it. And they've been feasting on garbage for so many years. These are, like industrial-sized Russian raccoons. I'll like bungee cord the top of my trash can so they can't get into it. They'll just drag the whole thing into the woods, like 30 feet. It's,
Nice. Bear size.
They're pretty significant, man. Like, and sometimes I'll catch them out there and I'll just kind of clap and be like, hey, get out of there, you little bandit. And then they'll just look at me. They'll just keep doing it. I have to get within like 5 feet for them to scurry away. They don't have fear anymore.
Yeah. They're bold creatures, but yeah, no, they can get big for sure. I'm just glad you're supplying the local raccoons.
Unwillingly. Yeah, I mean it's sort of like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I didn't really make the choice, but I guess they're going to have their commune here, and, there we go.
Wait, Capitol Hill, do you mean the one in Seattle?
Yeah, the
did
Chaz.
Did people make an autonomous zone in D.C.?
Oh, no.
It was called something else.
Well, I thought it was called, it was CH. I thought it was Capitol Hill, but I thought that referred to just a place in Seattle that was called that.
Oh, I guess it is. Sorry. When I thought of Capitol Hill, I thought of D.C. Okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah. Not that
so
Capitol.
Autonomous raccoons.
Yeah, the local autonomous raccoon zone. All right, we got a show, don't we? We're almost at the year mark, man.
Exciting. Yeah. If we can make it another week, we'll have accomplished something.
Yeah, and then it'll all fall apart immediately after that. Yep. All right. So we've definitely got a weird show today, but for Terminus Co-Prosperity Sphere, I've got a little thing for us to listen to. So last year we did a review of a band called Trash, and I also did an interview with Zach, the vocalist of that band. Zach, he's a longtime friend of mine. He's got another band that he just started up recently. It was playing live actively. It's not kind of an internet project thing anymore. So this is a band called Collapsor. They just put out their first EP called Devastation Path, I think like a month and a half ago, something like that. And I'm interested to see what you make of it, because me and the band, we both describe it as kind of like crossover grind, but based on the things you said about Trash, I want you to hear it and tell me kind of what you're hearing in this stuff. So we'll just listen to the title track, the opening song, Devastation Path.
Fucking
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, it's very interesting because when I first heard it, I was curious because it really is just kind of like it's just kind of thrash with blast beats when you get down to it.
Yeah, it reminds me of Morbid Angel.
Yeah, I could say that,
Morbid,
some of the Altars of Madness
Altar
shit.
stuff. Yeah, just the way that you have the blast and then those sort of riffs that are sort of like cranking up by 2 chords every time.
Yeah.
Which, if you slow it a little down over the thrash beats, it becomes like a pedal point thrash riff. But but Morbid Angel uses it to make those kind of like vertical architectural riffs. But even the way they were playing it had kind of that.
Yeah, it's got that effect. Well, it also kind of reminds me of almost like old Cogumelo stuff. Just that sort of falling over itself with forward momentum quality.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I don't know, like Dark Angel or something, Creator a bit, but like a more kind of Creator but more death metal-y intervals, a little more brooding. Yeah, it definitely feels like it definitely grinds, but in terms of the basic riffing elements, it definitely seems just like super aggressive thrash. If there's any crossover that actually sounds like that, let me know, because in my experience, I've found it always disappointing. I think crossover was always like this kind of like bouncy, fun stuff that I just didn't get.
I mean, if you go to some of the most aggressive stuff by like DRI or SOD, I can hear it. I mean, SOD was cool. Like speak English or die would be worth going back to at one point.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah. All right, so rundown for today. We got a kind of a weird setup because we basically ended up with 3 albums that are all kind of working within the same vocabulary, like very closely, and one odd man out. Yeah. So starting off, of course, with the odd man out is going to be the second full length by Devoured from Indonesia, titled The Curse of Sabda Palon, which was released on Sadist Records just this past week. Devoured, a band I've got a little experience with, who started as a brutal death band back in the early 2000s, but now has completely renovated their sound, so I was definitely excited to check that one out. And following that, we've got the newest record by the Czech band Inferno with Paradeigma, Phosphenes of Aphotic Eternity, released on Debemur Morti. Which is, I think, as far as kind of like arty black metal labels, they're probably one of my favorites.
We definitely cover a lot from them. Yeah.
Yeah, we do.
So, all right.
Yeah,
so next.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no! Did you have more to say? Sorry.
Oh no, just Inferno. May or may not be familiar with them. Very long-running Czech black metal band who, again, kind of tying it back to Devoured, I knew back in the day, but have substantially changed their sound over the years since I last listened to them, so I'm excited to dig into that.
Word. And for our listeners, that background noise was the raccoons. They have actually they have penetrated the death metal guy's security perimeter.
I'm jumping into the pillbox right now.
Yeah. All right, so after the break, then, it will be the new one by a band called Fyrnask, Fyrnask, which is, I think, multi-country but centered in Germany. This is coming out on Von Records, and the record is called 7 in Roman numerals, Kenoma. When you hear a name like that, you know it has something to do with Orthodox black metal, and it does. But it's different, a bit more of a sort of pagan mysticism theme rather than the usual unholy cosmic serpent, devour my soul kind of thing. Interesting sound. Interesting sound that has a lot to do with sort of dark ambient and stuff like that, which is going to be a common thread on these last 3 bands. Next one is, and last, is The Old Beast Law by Secret Fire. Secret Fire is a fairly new project. I think he's done a couple dark ambient releases before. And this is out on his own label, Throne of May, which is pretty cool. And up till now has just been posting dank medieval pictures on Instagram. But this is the first release. Yeah, it's kind of like black metal, but filtered through a sort of post-industrial or neofolk aesthetic, and with those kinds of atmospheres. And it's pretty interesting. So that's that.
All right, first up, new record by Devoured, The Curse of Sabda Palon. So, as I said at the top, Devoured's a band I've got a little bit of experience with. I heard some of their old material way back in the day, and it's weird, there's a significant gap. Their first full-length record, this being their second, was back in 2012. So there's a big 9-year gap, and it doesn't look like it involved a lot of lineup changes or something. I guess life just got in the way for those guys. But in the intervening period, things changed substantially for them. So Devoured is an Indonesian band, and for those who don't know, Indonesia actually has a huge brutal death scene, as well as a pretty solid black metal one that's, starting to develop more and more these days. And Devoured was originally in that first kind of wave of Indonesian brutal death bands that were coming out in, the early to mid 2000s. So just so we have a little bit of context, so people can understand what a big shift this record is, let's listen to something off their first album from 2012. This is just going to be the opening minute or so of a track called Vengeance and Blood. So already you can probably hear a pretty substantial difference between that and the record we're covering today.
Oh, yeah. Fairly down the line brutal death. Seems to fall in the niche of kind of blasty parts that sound like Morbid Angel, and then those kinds of all palm muted 16th note runs that Exterminated do so much.
Yeah. Very, very traditional, well executed, but definitely like a form that I'm pretty used to. And it's pretty typical of kind of the Indonesian sound where, a lot of it kind of owes to New York death metal, like those ending kind of groove riffs or very dying fetus, like grotesque impalement, that kind of thing. So 9-year gap between then and now. And now what we've got is a very curious kind of I guess we were kind of debating in the notes how to refer to this, because this is much more of an old school death metal record, but it feels extremely modern at the same time.
Yeah, I guess we got to figure that out. It's also other little tidbit. I just looked at the Metal Archives, and it looks like they had a demo in 2002, so it was even 10 years before their first demo and their first full length. So they've been listening to this music seriously with the ears of musicians for almost 20 years. And they just have not been that, they haven't been as conventionally productive as some bands, right? But they, Like, so there's a lot of experience going into this, and it's and that must have shaped their taste in the intervening time. So I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think we agree that this sounds a lot like Swedish death metal.
Yeah, I mean, the most obvious reference point is going to be Dismember. I remember when I first skimmed, like, the first promo track and decided to cover this one, I was like, oh, this sounds a lot like Dismember, which was always my favorite of the Swedish death metal scene. And then I saw they actually do a cover of Dreaming in Red at the end of this record, so there you go.
How would you describe the signature Dismember sound for people? I mean, this sounds to me. I know you like the later Dismember stuff. I really just know Everflowing Stream, which this does sound like.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like Everflowing Stream. I think there's a couple riffs that are direct nods to stuff off Everflowing. But then later down the line, like, even on the following album, the second album by Dismember is my favorite, Indecent and Obscene, which is actually where Dreaming in Red comes from. You get the kind of fundamental hardcore infused kicks of Swedish death metal, but they bring it a little bit closer to, melodic death metal pre-Gothenburg, as we understand it. So they hit this really nice, unique midpoint between this more kind of neoclassical, more structurally informed style and something that's just very brutish and thudding. So, and it's always been the juxtaposition between those two is what always made Dismember really special to me.
Yeah, and I think that was there on Everflowing Stream too, for sure. You've got big, some simple but big epic melodic riffs thrown in, like on Override of the Overture or something like that. And you can definitely hear nods to that here. But often when people think of sort of old school and Sweden, and maybe if they think of Dismember, right, they're just going to think of the Sunlight Studios sound, right? And the sort of quote-unquote Swedeth template that at this point has become, it's almost like a template has less to do with old Swedish death metal than the parts of it that people focus on in retrospect, right? Which is really like Entombed, Dismember, Carnage, things that sound like that have the D-beat bass and this sort of chunky, high-speed thrash guitar under it or over it. And what's interesting to me about this is, like, it seems very Swedish, but it seems to draw on a broader idea of what Swedish death metal is, like just like a more comprehensive idea of, like, instead of just the Swedeth sound, death metal from Sweden before 1994 or whatever. And which was a much broader family, right? So I thought we would so can I go into my first sample from that, or do you have anything?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So as an example of that, this first sample is from the end of Hasut Yarat Bunu, which is the third track. And we're going to start out at the end of a kind of dismembery passage. You can hear the kind of cycling chords and the big solo that you would get in, like, a song like Override or a number of others off of Everflowing Stream. But then they're going to pitch into something that is still Swedish, but a very different flavor than what we usually get. Here we go.
Mottager, mottager, var. Vart du in i var,
I didn't notice it the first time. What's that big, like, keening siren sound at the end there? Is that just like a lead guitar just hitting a big bend, or is that a synth?
I don't know. It's pretty cool, right? That kind of echoing part.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. It could be a lead guitar, but yeah. It sounds like it could be a really delayed lead, but yeah, it's pretty cool and interesting, right? But yeah, so from before that comes in, you just get this kind of barreling kind of spooky minor tremolo, and that sounds way more like kind of Swedish Black Death stuff. That sounds like, this is after 94, but it sounds like Dark Side era Necrophobic, or the more death metal-y riffs in Dissection, in that it has a bit of a black metal melodic quality to it, but it's played on low-end single-string tremolo. It's not something that you would. I don't think you'd really expect too much like that on a on the kind of standard Swedeth type thing that we usually get, which is often guys from the punk scene who latch onto the chunkiest types of riffing. And there are other big melodic leads like that, especially on the early tracks. Like, I think the best one is actually on the title, on, I guess, the first, the title track, I think, the Curse of Sabda Palon. It's got this, like, basically like a Once Sent from the Golden Hall riff. It's like even more, less spooky, more kind of epic and vaguely folky, almost maybe a bit of Southeast Asian folk in there, but there's this really cool big melodic trem hook riff. And these things all kind of relate to the melodicism in Dismember, but I think also gesture at these other kinds of death metal that were also active in Sweden at that time.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of... what this record does really well is it splits a careful line between sort of like straight up old school Swedish indulgence, as well as understanding that there was like structurally really intricate stuff happening on a lot of those songs. Like you brought up Necrophobic is a really good example of a band who was operating sort of within the same scene, but used the black metal influence more in these, the way they were kind of constructing songs narratively, in some of the melodic gestures, but it was still, like, Necrophobic still reads fundamentally as, like, a death metal band at heart to me. The black metal influences are not made through the most obvious gestures, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's more, the basic structures are all death metal. I mean, on Dark Side, they are using things like the dark funeral chords, in part because they shared a member, right? For one moment. But it's all, but it will all be in kind of individual textures used on individual riffs or melodic qualities. They're definitely structured like Swedeth songs or Swedish death metal songs.
I can hear that. But I like on certain tracks, especially towards the back half of this album, I start picking up on like greater Scandinavian death metal ideas. Like I feel like I'm hearing flickers of like Sentenced, or like really early At the Gates, or even just kind of weird also ran stuff like Cadaver, you know, that always had a little bit more of an interesting, more bespoke sort of melodic style than a lot of people would think.
Yeah, well, you got an example for that?
I do a little bit later, but first I just want to go to the very following track. This is off Ambigo Kuasa, and so the riffing on this record is very strong, but I think the thing that makes it special is the vocal performance and the drum performance, both of which are really interesting here. They're doing very sort of unexpected, unconventional things. Especially with the vocals, and you'll be able to hear that here. There's a really kind of over-the-top, frantic vocal performance across this record, but I think it's one of the centerpieces of the album. So, let's just try out Ambigu Kuasa. All right, so we got some pretty weird stuff going on that one, right?
Well, yeah. Well, what's weird about it?
Well, okay, so just kind of going through the sample. So the opening part, the the riff figure is a pretty conventional Dismember kind of thing. You've got that kind of slinky, but not in like the Phrygian way, sort of, weaving and, kind of wavering melodic riff. But then you get 3 different vocal tracks that just emerge simultaneously. You got one left, one right, and one center channel. And all of them are kind of growling in different styles, and all of them seem to have completely different lyrics. I think the one in the left channel is like a repeated chant of just a few words, and then the one on the right is doing like maybe a delayed accent of certain phrases from the main one in the middle, but it's very, very kind of cacophonous. But also, interestingly, it gives this strange sort of like Southeast Asian folk quality to it, because I've listened to a fair amount of Southeast Asian folk stuff, and you'll have these kind of, typically there's more of a melodic aspect, but these kind of polyphonic, intertwining vocal lines, and I think that's really interesting to have here. And then, after that, there's that big preparatory, like, stomp riff, that they're using as a bridge. And you think, oh, we're just going to do kind of a breakdown from there. No, it's a head fake, and they go into this sort of, like, slow hammering blast section, and then one of those big Kerry King solos, and then a variation on that again. It's just the way things line up are not traditional. There's always these kind of small surprises tucked away throughout all these songs, and I really appreciate that.
That's funny about those vocals. That's a good example of something that you can hear that I can't. Like, I literally could only hear 2 voices there. Probably because I wasn't noticing the left-right split.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, there's like 3 distinct lines in there. They're all doing different rhythmic patterns.
I hear what you mean about, like, emphasizing the voices as related to folk, though. Because, like, some of the dudes from that black, war metal band, War Cult, they're like in a that's Indonesia, right? Yeah.
Yeah, they're Indonesian.
They're in They're in this sort of art folk vocal ensemble where they're all reconstructing folk songs using death metal vocals and black metal vocals. And it seems like that must have some sort of relationship to, I don't know, like throat singing based traditional styles or something, but there's definitely like an emphasis on vocal performance, I think.
Oh yeah, well, Indonesia itself is, Indonesia as a nation is very similar to, say, the Philippines, where it is really, 200 different ethnic groups and folk traditions and ideas that have just been sort of lumped together in modern times. Because what these guys seem to specifically focus on is Javan mythology. Like Sabda Palon, okay. I had to do some research on it, and then I had to do more because I realized that most of the English language sources I was able to find were bullshit, so I had to go to Google Translate to find actual Indonesian ones. So, excuse me. So Sabda Palon apparently was some sort of, like, clergy / an advisor to King Brawijaya V, who, and it's hard to tell if this is historical or mythological. It's probably both, in a sense. So King Brawijaya was the last of the sort of Hindu-Buddhist empire that had controlled Java for many, many centuries. And he converted to Islam, or, on the historical side, maybe he was overthrown in a coup or he was invaded. It's very hard to tell.
Yeah. The version I read said something like he bowed the knee to the invader, so maybe he was defeated and then converted.
Something like that, yeah. I had to check. This is all folk tradition, so it's like you're going to see these different variations on the same general theme. And so Sabda Palon, his advisor, basically cursed him for this, and this would have been in 1476, I believe, and he said that in 500 years he was going to return to sweep Islam from the islands and return to the Hindu tradition of the previous empire. And it was interesting just doing some reading about how, like, 500 years later, people did start, building new temples, like, almost to the year. Yeah, specifically, that was
really cool.
That the ball got rolling, that people were literally anticipating this 500-year mark of the return of Hinduism in a big way to Indonesia. So, it's a very interesting subject matter, and I'm kind of amazed that there's stories that are that interesting and cool, and there's just really no good English language resources on it.
Yeah, dang. Well, that is pretty cool indeed. Okay, so for something a little more lowbrow. So the other thing about how comprehensive the idea of Swedish death metal on here is that it doesn't just move laterally, like out from the usual bands everyone focuses on, like sideways to their contemporaries. It also moves kind of backwards to stuff that... Yeah, well, we'll get into it, but it moves kind of backwards to things that you might hear on Nihilist or Early Grave or stuff from before then in the late 80s, those bands that were reference points for Altered Dead. So I really liked the beginning of Ambigu Kuasa. That had that kind of quality for sure, right before your sample started. But Siasat Sang Maha Pati Parapurna from towards the end has just some charging high-speed stuff that sounds almost more deliberately primitive in a way that I really like. So let's check that out.
There's all that punk and old school death metal that everyone forgot about, right?
Yeah, well, weirdly, everyone always, they always say that, but they go back to the sort of chunky, groovin' Entombed or whatever, right? But, yeah, if you listen to, I believe this is true of Nihilist, it's for sure true of Grave and whatever. You have these just, instead of, the sort of pocket grooving D beats, they have these, really frantic skank beats that are almost blast beats. Or they'll have, something, I guess you could call them, slap blasts or something, which are just basically like the skank beats, but backwards when you're leading with the snare. And this record has a lot of both of those. Just really kind of pushing the tempo in a way that's, you get in proto-death metal thrash, and then in death metal, and then in this kind of early death metal, especially in Sweden. And the riff, right? The riff has that, those are blue, that's basically a blues scale.
Yeah, you got the big kind of ascending pentatonic thing, which you point out in the notes is a very kind of Southeast Asian folk thing.
Yeah, it's being used in a way that doesn't really sound... It's cool, because it's not being used to really sound bluesy or rock and roll. It seems like it might be, gesturing, again, in this folk direction, in a way that they do kind of light, kind of without making a big deal about it throughout the album. But yeah, for listeners, if they want to hear an example of that kind of pentatonic feel in Southeast Asian extreme metal, you could check out the Thai bands Surrender of Divinity or Lotus of Darkness. But yeah, like, so pretty cool. And I guess that also connects it to another band you mentioned in the notes here, which is Incertus.
Yeah, I mean, Incertus was a band that I kept coming back to because we found this whole thread of kind of old school oriented death metal bands that are using modern techniques to make them much more extreme than they originally were. In Certus, you've got that just ridiculously brutal vocal performance that at first seems inappropriate, but then it makes perfect sense. The idea of transforming old Bathory songs into these, like, crushing death metal tracks. And I think that there's similar ideas happening here, just in that there's a similar, a mirroring idea of reaching back to old stuff, but not sacrificing any of the sort of modern abstraction that we now have, in the tool chest, so to speak.
Yeah, so what I'm wondering is, like, at what point does it start to be, so one thing that's interesting is, okay, we're realizing that Incertus is not as eccentric as it initially appeared to be, as in there are other bands doing this kind of thing. And, we could, Alter Dead is maybe more, in some sense, sounds less eccentric than either of these bands, but is equally oriented towards, like, in their case, like, pre-91 death metal, right? But it also sounds super modern.
Yeah, so, I mean, the thing that makes these guys distinct... Oh, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so at what point is it like... I see how they're drawing from the same well as the OSDM bands, but maybe at what point should we just let this be, like, new? Like, okay, they're using, like, maybe they are finally breaking the OSDM curse. And, like... using those instead of doing this kind of nostalgia trip homage stuff, using a material that has been consigned to, like, retro aesthetics for a long time, using it to make more new sounding stuff. I think it's kind of an open question, because in many ways this is very wedded to those old school styles, structures for sure, but it also is more than all of these bands, it's more than like a superficial updating.
Yeah, no, it's not a matter of just playing it with like modernized production or greater technical ability. They're using kind of some of the deep structural development that's happened in extreme metal. Over the course of however many years, depending on, where your throwback point is. And I guess I don't really know the answer to that question either, because, I mean, clearly there's a thread that's getting picked up on by a lot of newer death metal bands, or at least, in the case of Devoured, an older band that's putting out one of their infrequent records. I guess we're just going to have to see if it really coalesces into something. I mean, we're seeing it in fits and starts here and there on a bigger scale. We're seeing a lot more old school oriented bands who are making, I mean, for instance, look at last year, one of the best records of the year, the Sepulchral Curse record, which obviously that's extremely old school Finnish death metal at its heart, but it's light years beyond what most of those guys were doing back in the day structurally. So we're just going to have to see how it shakes out, I guess.
Fair enough.
But maybe one clue is going to be on my last sample. So here is what I think is one of the most ambitious parts of the record. I really enjoyed the first half, but it was the second half of this album that really grabbed me, where I started to realize, oh, there's some, like, very subtle things happening in this. There's some really ambitious structural conceits going on. And I think that if you listen to a track like this, try to connect it mentally to some of the, like, the Hessian Firm stuff that we've covered. And
I was hearing that connection too. I think in the first sample I pulled with that kind of necrophobic sounding lead, that's really Hessian Firm.
Oh yeah, no, definitely in terms of like the riffing style, but here you're going to hear that applied to the sort of convoluted Hessian-firm song structures. And then I think it's like, oh, okay, so maybe there really is kind of a movement going on. So this is off of Dang Hyang Sabda Palon, towards the beginning, and I think this is probably my favorite track. So yeah, on that one, I definitely want to draw attention to like the back half of that sample, where you've got the what would be sort of just like a big behemoth riff or something, but they proceed to go through. They probably clock like 5 different variations of it, throughout it. Like it's hard to tell because there's so much going on the guitars. I think this is a place where there's like 3 separate guitar lines. There's like 2 leads and a rhythm, and you think, okay, so you can hear the leads doing a long sort of winding melody, sort of in like the Into Oblivion style. But then what you might not know is, because it's a little buried in the production, is the actual riff itself, the rhythm riff with those big held chords, keeps changing. They keep doing different voicings of those chords, slowly changing them and developing them. And actually, instead of making them more melodic, they're making them slowly more chromatic, as it goes into this crushing traditional kind of death metal blast section right after this.
Yeah, I was done. A little blue balled that you cut it off right there. That was pretty sick.
I know. I just like, because, well, I really like the head fake stuff these guys do. Like, this opens with a big sort of doom death riff, and then it just breaks into something else. Like, they really commit to not doing the easy thing, which is something I talk about a lot on this show. They try to take the harder path in a lot of these songs.
There were at least 8 riffs in that passage, right? I mean, maybe more. And it never sounded schizo.
It's all natural.
Yeah, and for a lot of it, they just they kind of used the that kind of 1-2 skank Slayer beat drumming to weave it together. That was kind of, you just keep the drummer charging along, and in this classically Swedish way, but you're changing things over it in a different way. I also thought that the riffing towards the end with that sort of morphine behemoth riff, which I guess does make sense as a description, it was kind of weird. It had a hypnotic quality to it that you don't usually get with death metal riffing. That and some of the riffs before it. This was all a little more that's all I was going to say.
Well, I think that what you're hearing there is that there is this undercurrent of kind of Southeast Asian folk. There's this undercurrent of the sort of mythological or historical underpinnings of this music being important to the content. You know, it does have kind of this darkly mystical feel. It does have that taste of Southeast Asia in it. And that's really the way to do it. It should be a subtle sort of informing aspect of the music. This is a record that does, you know, you're starting with Dismember, but then you're ending up in a very different place altogether. And I think for that reason alone, it's worth listening to.
Hey, it's Kari from Sepulchre Curse.
And I'm Jakob.
You're listening to Terminus.
Alright, we are back. And now we begin a descent into madness for 3 albums straight. So like we said at the top, this is a little odd because 2 of the like flagship records that we chose, and really it kind of ends up being 3 of the records for today, are all sort of operating with very similar raw materials. And I'd say those materials are going to be Orthodox black metal, sort of pagan black metal with a sort of melodic flair, some little hints of like goth and post-punk and stuff like that. And that goes across all 3 of these next records we're going to be covering, in various different shades. So you're going to hear a lot of different ways to use the same material that results in completely different music, despite how much they have in common. Would you agree?
I think number 3 is a little bit has more different raw material than Inferno, and I think Inferno and Fyrnask really do have a lot of the same raw material. I think what connects Secret Fire to these, yeah, there are some similar influences for sure. You can find them, but what really connects all 3 of them, I think, is it's black metal being made with the sensibility of different genres, and those genres are something like a little bit different in each case, but various kinds of sort of atmospheric, electronic, and post-industrial music.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
I think so, because I think you actually hit on some things with Inferno that I was kind of grasping at, but I think you got a little bit more immediately than me. So, speaking of which, so the first record of this rundown, we're going to be going between these records a lot, as far as, you know, we're going to be talking about all of them in each review.
I didn't realize that, but that's a good idea.
Oh no, I think that's just going to come up naturally, because I can't talk about the Inferno without talking about the Fyrnask and vice versa.
I get that.
So Inferno's Paradeigma, Phosphenes of Aphotic Eternity. So I actually brought this on the show because I was at a bandmate's place the other day, and he was talking about listening to this a lot, and he showed me a little bit of it, and I thought it was really cool, and I ended up checking it out later, and I thought this had been released, you know, maybe a couple years back, but no, it turns out this is a brand new record by Inferno. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Inferno, very long-running Czech black metal band. I think they trace back to, like the mid to late 90s. And I'm a little bit familiar with older Inferno material, like from around the mid-2000s is where I heard some of their records and splits and stuff like that. And I remembered them as being extremely solid, extremely rigorous black metal, sort of in like the Cult Offensive tradition, but not quite as like hermetic and abstract as that. So
as like you said before the show, not quite as grumbly.
Yeah, not quite as grumbly. So just as a reference point for the older style they were playing in, which after hearing it again, I started to realize has more connections to this than I thought. Let's listen to the title track off their 2003 record, and apologies in advance for butchering this, V navratu poanství, something to that effect. So let's listen to a little bit.
That sounded all right. Yeah.
It sounded Czech.
That was
it probably isn't.
That was plausible. Okay.
Yeah, that's what matters. So let's listen to just a chunk from the middle of this. See, that's pretty fucking cool music.
That's pretty sick, dude. I like that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if you like that stuff, I absolutely recommend any of Inferno's old material, full lengths, and there's a lot of great stuff buried on all these different splits they did with various other kind of underground European black metal bands. It's just you're at you're at no risk of running out of material with these guys because they're extremely prolific. So, like I was saying, so Inferno back then is like, okay, it's very rigorous in this Czech sense. I mean, I think at this point we've decided that, like, the banner of Czech black metal, even if it's eccentric, kind of is Cult Offensive, of just, like, it's oppressively traditional, but also very abstract at the same time.
I feel like Cult Offensive is at a good midpoint between Master's Hammer. Like, it's got the vocals and the willful kind of weirdness. It's like good midpoint between Master's Hammer or stuff like this, or Triumph Genus, or you know, yeah,
or fucking was it a? No, I was thinking of the wrong band. I was gonna say Mortuary Drape, but no, they're from Italy. I always forget.
But
yeah. So, but that's kind of the memory I had of this band. So then. A couple of days ago, I'm listening to Paradeigma, and I'm like, well, holy fuck, something changed. Now, I haven't listened to a lot of the records between these two eras, but I think it's on their 2013 or maybe their 2017 record where they really split into this new direction. And in terms of describing what that is, that's kind of hard to describe. I mean, it's Orthodox black metal in a sense, but it's structured in a very, very different way. And you had some interesting ideas about what you think kind of the structural core of this music is.
Well, okay, yeah. If I guess I could get to it here. So yeah, I mean, certainly Orthodox stuff. You mentioned in the notes, Aosoth, Ruins of Beverast is relevant. That for sure sounds right. Bloodhouse Nord. For me, I think that all seems right. I would add like, a band like Lichgate, in the sense that this is black metal that seems highly influenced by Funeral Doom. Right, we get some organs in here, and probably just in terms of the general vibe and the crazy vocals, Portal. Right?
Yeah.
But, the basic guitar technique, the chording, really does come from Orthodox BM. But this is, so what's different about this? What's holding all these different name checks together? Well, this sounds really crazy. And in places, in some places, it cleaves pretty closely to standard riff patterns, but in a lot of others, in a lot of the most exciting places, it seems to sort of come completely unstuck from traditional ideas of riff or even melody.
Yeah, that's true.
It just kind of flies free in this. You get these free-floating textures that of a kind that you do get in various kinds of electronic music, but there's a sort of wildness to it that's pretty unique.
I would say, I hate applying this word to black metal just because every time I've heard it used, it usually sucks. Yeah. I think this is the first record that I'll describe positively as psychedelic black metal.
Yeah, it is definitely that, right? And it sort of like moves away from like, this any sort of anchoring melodic center, but yet it's not like wishy-washy formless goo. There's this kind of like I wrote this in my notes, so I'll just say it's from my notes. There's sort of this high intensity fluid dynamic kind of shape to it. It's like, or high density. It's like movements of mysterious forces, right?
Yes.
And so what makes it do that? Well, like, the obvious question is like, how the fuck do you hear that? I get how people composing in an electronic vein can sort of, can do that. But the particular way this band does it, I think what's happening is that even though this occupies sort of the same general territory as a lot of these like tightly controlled one-man studio projects, this is a band, and I think they jammed these ideas, and I think this band is like literally strongly influenced by jammy music, or at least by the idea of jamming. Particularly like jammy electronic music. So shit that would be, as far as like stuff that is electronic, intense, qualifies as extreme metal, and is like cool, but is also sort of like linked to ravey festival music. I'd say like psytrance would be.
I thought you were going to say coil until you got to the rave part.
No, this doesn't remind me of. No, it really reminds me of like psytrance, or even like kind of more shit like that. That's like actually like Coil did improvise a lot, and maybe these guys, I wouldn't be surprised if these guys like Coil, but like it really has a quality of they anchor into grooves and then riff on them, and I think that occasionally it's a weakness, but very often it's a strength. And I've wanted to hear, like, I've said things on this show before about how I've been interested in people opening up black metal structures and like wanting to hear more improvisatory stuff, and this is a kind of cool path to it. So are you good to get into the samples?
Oh yeah. We've got back-to-back samples from one song, and I think it's like we always say on the show. If we do that, that means that there's something important happening. That's usually a sign of like an album that we're really interested in. This album also has just a couple big centerpiece tracks, and this is for sure. I feel like the first major track on this one is kind of like an overture. It's like, here are the different parts on this record. Here are some cool parts. The album goes on. So the part that you get to from this song, which is Descent into Hell of the Future, certainly a timely title, is the part you get to is really sick. And what's interesting is that it comes out of what I think is maybe the weakest moment on the album. And when I was first listening to this part, I was like, oh, like, what's going to happen from here? Let's listen to it. And keep in mind the idea of jamminess. Okay. Yeah, let's go. Yeah, it's funny. You did manage to select what I think is probably the single most boring part of the record.
Arg! It's the Orthodox chord progression, right? It's just the straight duh 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 duh. Just
Every Orthodox record gets one, you know.
Yeah, and you can use it in different ways. And in this case, they use that melodic idea which here doesn't sound good, to launch into something that's really cool. But this part, you just get this kind of cliche Watain riff distilled to the very basics over these kind of chunky backbeat drums, and it kind of just sounds like Sepultura on ketamine, you know? But that's only if you isolate it. It gets pretty cool after this, and I really like this album generally. But this part doesn't really work, and you can hear it not really working as a consequence of the perils of jamminess, right? It's just you find a groove, you groove on it, and then the vocalist and whoever's messing with the synths does some stuff over it.
Yeah, because it's improvisation, or at least that sort of methodology for writing. I mean, there's gradients of it, of how much is improvised or not. It's always a risk-taking venture, because on one hand, either everyone's locked in, and you all just find the perfect way to move between different passages, or you get a section like this where you're kind of like fumbling in the dark. You're looking for the light switch, you're looking for the way out into something. And I feel like that's what's happening here. Like, it feels kind of placeholdery.
You get locked into a holding pattern, yeah. And sometimes those holding patterns can feel very satisfying to play, but not so much to listen to, right? Which is why people make fun of jam bands, right? I mean...
No, yeah.
I don't know if, Psytrance is the exact right reference point, but, I think it would have to be relevant. But there are other kinds of just, jammy festival electronic music where people will just, lock into a groove, and there will be some weebles and woobles over it and shit like that. Yeah.
Well, I also think that, it doesn't happen too often on this record, but I would say the kind of, straightforward Orthodox rock parts are easily the weakest points on the record. I think they could all the sort of Watain stuff, you could excise all of that, and nothing would be lost.
No question, these guys can write riffs and shit, right? We just heard that on the old record, but this is, although the lineups have changed somewhat, but I'm sure these guys can all write riffs, right? But this is not a riff oriented. This record is not a riff oriented record.
Oh, definitely not. Yeah. Which is a place where when we get to it, I'll compare it to Fyrnask, because this is, like I said, we're dealing with very similar raw material for both these bands, but where Inferno is really into this sort of traditional electronic or ambient way of composing songs, of shifting textures into each other. Fyrnask is really interested in isolated negative space for every single part. There's a
separation.
There's a deliberate sense of separation where, versus in Inferno, at the best points on this record, there's no separation whatsoever. You cannot draw any one thing in particular from a moment in a very cool way.
Well,
which we're about to get to that, actually.
Yeah, and so I was going to say, to segue, I think in defense of the riffing on this album, parts like this that you're about to get into, this involves riffing that is good. It's centered, you can follow the guitars here, and it's a cool riff, but it's not it's not working with a conventional pattern. It's this very weird shape that's made. They take that one Orthodox chord progression and start using it as the modular unit for this bizarre Lovecraftian shape they start building with it. And that's cool.
Yeah, so let's get to the next part of Descent into Hell of the Future. Right after your section, we're going to be continuing off the very tail end of that kind of jam session, and it's just going to crack open from there.
Yeah.
So, I did not think this was possible. This is something that I've been kind of searching for my whole life. How do you make a blast beat and a tremolo riff sound like skepticism? Oh, you can do it. Apparently they cracked the code. At that very last one there, it's like, wow, that sounds like something off early skepticism. It just completely contorted in terms of tempo.
Yeah. I mean, even some of that string, even, that crazy kind of the crazy turnaround that opens that, where you get this sequence of chords, is that even that kind of has a skepticism quality to it in places.
Yeah, it's so obviously this is a record that's kind of impossible to sample, because even more than usual when we say that, because everything is just textures shifting into one another. There's very few distinct musical passages on this. It is almost a cliche to say, but this definitely is written and constructed in a way much more like advanced electronic music than it is like heavy metal songwriting. Because the primary unit here is not the riff, it is the texture. There's riffs going on, but this is fundamentally made through contrasting sound objects, contrasting timbres, and the narrative is kind of carried through that.
Manipulated vocals. I mean, those are a huge, a surprisingly large proportion of the crazy whooshing sounds are vocals.
Are just the vocals that are just like it's like they were done very quietly, and then reverb and amplification was poured onto it in just this bizarre way, and they're so far in the background they really do just become almost like an undulating synth texture underneath everything. And it's like, just in terms of the timbre of everything and how these layers are constructed, I mean, it's some of the most vast music I've heard in extreme metal. Just like the scope of it just seems impossibly huge.
Yeah, it's I don't know if would I go to most vast. I'm not sure, but it definitely is vast.
Yeah, I don't. There's something about this that hits me especially because I'll spoil it. I think this is probably going to be on my year-end list because I think I'm gonna get obsessed with this and keep listening to it and trying to pick more parts out. It's there's something very unique and there's something very difficult to talk about with this music. Trying to pull out any individual elements or ideas is extremely difficult, which is one of the things that makes it so kind of fascinating and exciting to me, I think.
Yeah, I think also it's sophisticated music that's also kind of viscerally enjoyable.
Yeah. It's not like pure abstraction in the way that something like Devilgroth is.
And it's not
close.
Yeah, so let's do you want to go to, I guess mine is from earlier in the album, but
sure.
Do you want to go to yours or mine next?
Yeah, let's go to yours because mine's from the last song, and we'll go back and forth. Sure.
Yeah, the last song's cool. So this is so here, I mean, I would say this section is strictly analogous to my first sample. But here, the jammy quality of it is that they're killing it. This is the example of really good jammy black metal. You're going to hear there's a groove and there's things happening over it, but it feels extremely different from the last one. So this is Ecstasis of the Continuum. And this was the part where when I got to this, whatever sort of doubts I was feeling were dispersed. I was like, "Oh, this is cool. This is legit." And I got this is the moment where I started really headbanging.
All right. Yeah, it's well, it's interesting because I mean the only, like you said, it is directly analogous to your first sample, and only a couple things are really different, but I think they're that important. One, you don't have the kind of stereotypical Orthodox riff. You're just cruising on like one chord through most of that, and also the thing that makes it interesting, which is very electronic, is that single like gossamer thread of that synth. Moving through different effect patterns, moving through the flanger and, changing in timbre and contorting, and you're fascinated by the evolution, and it's just like a single tone. It's not melodically doing anything. It's purely through the textures that it's so engrossing.
Yeah, that was the thing I was wondering, is like a lot of the dense textures are not harmonically that complex. They're just wildly dispersed through different sounds.
But
the very beginning of that, your last sample, or no, wait, sorry, was it? Where was the crazy 12-tone sounded shit again? Was that on your sample?
It was at the beginning of yours, but that's revealing right there. It's hard to tell where any of this is coming from.
Yeah, but that one was. You could hear this band is capable of real harmonic sophistication when they want to be, right? Like the very beginning of this sample with that strange, chiming, dissonant thing that you likened to Bloodhouse Nord, right? But then in this more jammy passage, it's definitely very like drone focused, just intensely layered octaves.
It's. I mean, the whole melodic dimension of this record, like what you're able to pick out through all the layering, is very interesting because there's a lot of almost major key ideas on this. It's just very strange context that it pops up in.
Yeah, no. So this part, there are two chords. It's even more now because there are two chords here, just like the 2-chord riff on the last one. But this is just a whole step descent. So it puts you in the territory of like it suggests kind of pentatonic drone, which can imply both major or minor. And in this case, I think they're suggesting a little bit of major. And the thing that it really sounds like, the thing between those drums and... Yeah, between the drums and the bass and the guitar, what it really sounds like is like krautrock or Hawkwind. Sort of like heavy, highly dosed 70s psych, right?
Yes, definitely.
And so you've got, the difference is that first one had kind of a like half-hearted syncopated groove, The guitar was kind of chunking along, and the drummer was doing this kind of like, breakbeat syncopated thing. Here,
a cool beat in search for a better part.
And just like more enthusiasm and a different, and no, I mean, I think that one was kind of a troped beat, but this is like this one has this kind of driving forward momentum. Like record critic dudes who know more about krautrock than me would call this motoric, motorik. It has that sort of like mid-tempo but very propulsive, repetitive, looping drums. Each with the little rolls kind of spill each unit over to the next one, and the bass you can hear is like locked into just, in some sense, it's rhythmically less complicated than the other one because the bass is just locked into
just cruising, walking bassline shit.
Super cruising. Lemmy was in Hawkwind before Motorhead, right?
Yeah.
So this just taps into this reptile brain drone groove, and the jamming is really working. And although the rhythms are less complicated than before, the playing here is way tighter and more committed, I think. Like you could hear that they're all bouncing off each other in the sort of energized way you get when you get a really good groove.
Yeah, you got that. Well, I mean, it's got that strident, forward marching quality of like Immortal or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, it's like this is the most leather jacket moment on the record, and it's sick.
Warrior at the edge of Blashirk.
Yeah. Well, also, but I was also thinking, 'cause especially when I saw you in the notes, you know, referencing stuff like Hawkwind and Krautrock, it's like maybe the origin for a lot of these ideas is much simpler than we're making it. Maybe just a lot of it is like Hivislis et Taros.
How so?
Well, I mean, obviously, Varg was always more interested in sort of like distinct movements in a way. He wasn't playing with stuff quite as much in terms of intersecting textures as these guys are, but the idea of these elongated, kind of strident, almost ambient passages that still have this very intense kind of forward-moving pulse to them, like listening to that section that you just played and listening to like Detso Mengang Var off Hivislis et produce very similar feelings to me, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, like, certainly, like, that's got to be one of the earliest for drone black metal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that could be an influence for sure. I mean, like, probably they're picking up on that aspect that's already in black metal and linking it to this other stuff. I mean, that part just literally does sound like Hawkwind or something like that. But, like, I hear that. That's probably relevant here. I mean, certainly their old stuff was very, very traditionalist, right? Sort of 90s black metal. So that makes sense.
I was just thinking because, I mean,
you know,
obviously,
also, Varg was listening to shit like that. Varg was into,
that's
like,
another reason I connected it, yeah.
Yeah, Tangerine Dream and various kind of spacey early electronics. And, you know, I say this every third show, but he would stand on the back of the rave drinking milk, right? How do you know which one of your friends will stab you?
By doing that. That's the guy.
Yeah, that's the guy, yes. Yeah.
All right, so for a last sample, I want to go to the final track. It's called Stars Within and Stars Without Projected into the Matrix of Time, which is sick. I love the song titles on this that are like kind of sci-fi and kind of Gnostic and kind of just... It's just like, I mean, you said in the notes, it's like, maybe these guys are just like huge fucking stoners. There's a real like dark weed energy. Dark side weed energy is the phrase that you came up with. This is dark side weed energy, like with Astral Tomb.
This is for sure dark side weed energy. And you know, you do get that with other Czech metal, but especially the grind, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, all the Czech grind is just like super stoned, or you can look, or something like, even like really primordial shit like, I don't know. Let me think. What would be a good example? Like, what has that real... probably like Root. Root has a sort of weed energy to it, to me.
Root could kind of be motoric.
Is that like some specific krautrock term?
Yeah, no, it's like, it's just a term for a vibe. It's a feeling, yeah. It's like, people used it to describe krautrock and other kinds of like heavy repetitive music in the 70s before... heavy repetitive music was really a thing, you know. You might
I gotcha.
You know, you would use it about like the shit like that or certain kinds of post-punk or whatever. It's just a term. It's a term I'm bringing from outside the metalverse into the metalverse. But
yeah,
you know,
I just hadn't heard it. Yeah,
and it's entirely possible that for these guys, they're actually more rooted in that than anything like psytrance. But what they certainly are is huge stoners.
I could definitely see that. So this is the last track on the album. I really like this. I don't have a ton to say about it apart from the texturing being some of the coolest I've ever heard on a black metal record. Mm-hmm. And you're going to hear way more of, okay, this isn't about riffs, this is about intersecting textures. But one thing I wanted to bring up, it's kind of an aside, but it's something we've talked about on the show a little bit before. Like, just looking at, like, YouTube comments and shit, so many people are talking about this being very evil and very scary and like dark music, which is like, that's not how I read this at all.
No!
There's nothing evil about this music. This is like drugged out and kind of like darkly mystical and it's cool. You're in sort of a bizarre, abstract landscape. You're not really sure what's going on, but nothing's threatening you here. You're just exploring a different dimension or something. I don't know. It was like, how is this evil? This isn't fucking evil, you know?
Yeah, that's noob shit, man. It's like, I mean, we've seen that on so many bands. Like, that comes up again and again. People commenting like, this is the most evil shit, and it's like, what do you mean? But this in particular is very good vibes, right? This isn't even like, I mean, you know, like, this is less malevolent than your average, you know, pagan
black metal record.
Yeah, your average pagan black metal record isn't evil, but it's highly invested in killing people with swords. Right?
Yeah, this isn't even about that.
No.
I just put this on and I remember how I feel when I do DMT sometimes, you know?
Yeah, dude. Yeah, it makes me miss being really fucked up at like shows. You had a really good way of describing this that you need to say on air.
I described it because a lot of people have talked about this as sounding like kind of chthonic, and it's like, okay, I can kind of get that. And I just said in the notes, it sounds like you're looking at Cthulhu, but like a nice Cthulhu with like pleasantly glowing tentacles, you know? He's just like, what's up, man? I know this is pretty weird for you, but just chill.
Yeah. It's like, Cthulhu hands you a bowl of really mellow kush just as Tool is coming on stage.
All right, so let's listen. Stars Within and Stars Without.
All right.
Do you want to eat some like weed gummies and go to the planetarium where they synced up the laser show to this album?
Hell yeah, bro.
It sounds awesome. We were talking while I was playing. It's like it suddenly came over me. This is the world's chillest black metal album, which
really is so chill.
Which, just the idea of describing that seems so antithetical to the style, but they really pull it off. It really is its own thing.
A phrase that, maybe it was you who called attention to this the other day, but a phrase that my friends and I used to have was, one could chill hard.
This is hard chilling, yes.
This is music for chilling very hard, yes. Yeah. Like, so you get a bunch of YouTube comments about evil and Cthulhu and all that, right? But then you get this guy who comments, just a second, scrolling down. There we go. Premature Apotheosis comments, everything these guys do is executed with the utmost masterful precision. I have a long drive in 2 days, so I'm going to wait and listening to this then. Windows down, joint in hand. I can't fucking wait. I am sure it will be the album of the year, in my opinion.
It's like, he gets it. Yeah, this is supposed to be like chill music. I kind of like the idea of, I don't think this is an album that's very... This is not an album like, say, Reverum Idmalacht, where you lock into it and you concentrate on what it is about. This record just kind of like wants to give you a push into introspection. You play it while talking to like your most interesting and kind of intellectual friends, and you see how the tones kind of send your conversation into interesting directions, you know? It's not a record that like insists itself, you know? It's not supposed to be the main feature.
With the right group of people, this would be like doing ecstasy music. I mean, I wish I knew girls that freaky now, but, you know, it's, like... All right, so we're coming back from a break for some droning atmospheric sludge with Fyrnask's 7 Kenoma out on Von Records. So, as we said up front, or as I guess as the death metal guy said at the beginning of our last review for Inferno, these last 3 bands we're covering have a lot of common threads. This is another one that's sort of like Inferno. It's heavily informed by Orthodox black metal guitar technique. It sounds very modern, and it is closely in dialogue with electronic stuff. In this case, more like dark ambient, neofolk, post-industrial. But the results, I mean, shitty journalistic cliche, but the results couldn't be more different. It's we were talking during one of the breaks that basically all these last 3 bands are cool wizard music, and this certainly is this, and the last one certainly is that. So Fyrnask it's been a while since their last their last full length. I think it was like 2015 or 16.
Yeah, something like that.
Or 2016, Forn. And although the music comes out of this sort of highbrow Orthodox tradition, the lyrical themes have always been grounded more in sort of paganism, but with an emphasis on sort of occult practice and on sort of the inner ideas more than just say reconstructing ancient ritual or whatever, right? So that's the thing it'll have in common with the Secret Fire too. I think there were sort of more Norse themes on the old stuff, and there's still a lot of what looks like Old Norse for the song titles here. But they say that the common theme running through the album is about sort of theodicy. That is Theodicy. That is the idea of the justification of the ways of God, or, since we're in a pagan tradition, gods to man. How do you explain the place of suffering in the world, right? And they're drawing, I think, especially on Persian myth in this one. So kind of a wide-ranging, kind of open concept of pagan and occult tradition. And a lot to do with suffering and ideas of hell and stuff like that on this. Yeah, so where else? What did you make of this?
Well, so obviously this is analogous to Inferno, as you said, in many ways. And this is, in a lot of ways, more of a modern black metal record than Inferno was. Like, Inferno is kind of like using black metal technique to do a weird thing. Whereas here, okay, this is a black metal record. I feel like the overwhelming, immediate influence is going to be Ruins of Everest. I mean, there's a lot of that on Inferno, but I think it's even more direct here. So this fits very comfortably onto Von as a label, which in terms of modern black metal labels has a more distinct identity to it than nearly anything out there. It's spacious, it's a little psychedelic, it pulls a lot of different influences from different corners of metal and outside of metal. I'm going to say, if there's one big thing that makes this very distinct from Inferno, it's that, well, one, there's a lot of post-black on this, and a lot of kind of straight post-rock stuff on occasion. But a big thread that we both picked up on, and this is another part of a conversation we've had for, a year now on the show, which is the continuing influence of Magla. Because there is a lot of Magla on this record in terms of the guitar technique, as well as a similar array of influences. Because, we talked about Magla, and you're the guy who kind of brought up the idea that, Magla is really just using a lot of kind of like goth rock technique. And I think there's a very conscious effort on the part of this band to use that as well. Both from Magla and directly from the source. But that's something you would know about better than I would, but I hear a lot of immediate similarities in a lot of those guitar ideas.
I can hear that for sure. I think I heard more of the Mugla vibe, but I think the Goths thing makes sense for sure. I wouldn't be surprised if they were getting that from the source. That might also account. I think a lot of the stuff that you may have heard as post, I kind of heard as Migla, Gothy, whatever. But certainly there are a lot of shimmering single string tremlines and things like that.
Well, at this point, you could almost say that what post-black metal actually is nowadays is Magla plus post-rock versus, what it was before Magla really came onto the scene. They kind of they accidentally hijacked post-black from outside of it.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's a good point. So it does connect to all that for sure. And I think other than that, right, this idea of sort of heavy hi-fi Orthodox black metal, if our big marker for the more melodic side of polished modern BM is Migla, then probably Eosoth is the other side of the equation for the Orthodox BM, and I feel like that's probably a reference point here. I get what you're saying about the Ruins of Beveres, but do you mean, I think I get it in terms of the overall vibe and scale of the album, and the kind of ambition, and I don't know that I heard particularly Ruins of Beverasty riffs, but maybe it comes together in that kind of. Actually, no, I did. I
mean, I think. You're correct.
I did,
I think...
and also the kind of glistening gothy stuff is something that's always been on Ruins of Beverast, and especially on Thule Grimoires. So.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's more of an agglutinative thing, because you can say a Ruins of Beverast riff. Well, which album? Because there's a shit ton of different kinds of Ruins of Beverast riffs, and there's a shit ton of different kinds of riffs on this album as well. But I think the very ornate, very sort of mystic quality of Ruins of Beverast comes through here, the same way that it kind of does on Inferno. Huge in scale, mystical. Not really about good or evil, kind of operating outside of that kind of thing.
Yeah, vast cathedral-esque spaces, really long songs. Yeah, that all makes sense. So I think we should kind of do I kind of want to call it lateral, and start the sampling with the last track.
Okay.
I'll move this up in the menu here, but So the last track is called Blodgud, which might mean blood god, but maybe good means something else. It depends on what. God might have an O in it. Who knows? Blood something. This is, the outro, interlude, ambient parts on this album are much more important than that would suggest. Basically, there's a lot of ambient stuff on this record that is pretty central to the record. It's not, in the same way that with Ruins of Beverest, it's not supposed to be filler. And these guys are quite good at doing that stuff. And I think, in some sense it's cheating to rely too much on stuff from the press release, but it can be a shortcut to realizing things that are important about this record. So basically the press release stresses that, dark ambient and sort of, I would assume, post-industrial and neofolk stuff is important for this band. And I think that is kind of informing the album throughout, even when it's using black metal riffing. So I wanted to get this in everyone's head so they can see this kind of part as more central to this band than it might seem. So this is from the beginning of Bloodgood. like that.
That's definitely a lot more your wheelhouse than mine. That's like, that's got all that neofolk stuff that it's like I respect, but I do not understand.
Yeah, you don't feel it. Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, so something like that. I mean, that would be a place where coil would really be relevant.
I can see that, yeah.
There are some really beautiful coil tracks, like First 5 Minutes After Death or At the Heart of It All. Really resonates with that. Also, I mean, Dead Can Dance is like a thing that, although people don't always mention it as an influence, I think it's a huge touchstone for a lot of things in that scene. I mean, in terms of more recent stuff, it kind of sounds like Lamia Vox, who's a one-woman artist located, I think, in Prague. But who does cool sort of epic voice stuff. There you get, yeah, some kind of sample-based, spacious, medieval sounding stuff, right? And that is maybe the moment where, like, the electronic or atmospheric elements become the most melodic, kind of take center stage. But they exist throughout it, and I would suggest that a lot, the black metal riffing on this record makes more sense if you think about it as doing things more like that than regular black metal riffing.
Yeah, I understand that. Because as we'll get into, the way these guys present their songs is very unusual. And I talked about that a little bit in the Inferno review regarding... I mean, it's something that you kind of point out. You phrased it better than me. The idea that they are all about articulating this negative space around these very specific musical passages. There's, I would say, an almost deliberately inorganic quality to the way a lot of this unfolds over the course of a song. There's not a lot of... There's not an effort to blend things in the way that is, like, typically the mark of, like, elegant metal songwriting. Because I don't think...
It doesn't flow.
It doesn't flow. But I was going to say, the caveat being, clearly they don't have any interest in making elegant heavy metal songs. So it requires, me to reframe what it's about as a listener. So it's like, this is one of those cases where this is very well-made music that revolves around a structural conceit that's, like, super alien to me. So I'm hoping you'll be able to kind of bridge the gap, because there's a lot of stuff on this record that I really like, but there's also some, like, very off-putting kind of ideas to me. But maybe I'm just missing some of the knowledge of, say, like, post-industrial or neofolk stuff to really tie all of this together.
Well, let's see.
Okay.
You said, I'll see what I can do. I think, the reasons you can't get so into this, I think, makes sense to me, for sure. It's definitely, it's definitely one of those records that's after such a specific and kind of deliberately alienating effect that if it's... A man of taste can easily say it's not his cup of tea. Right?
There's a certain segment of the listening population for whom this is going to be the album they pattern their whole lives after. You know what I mean? There's certain people out there who are going to hear this and be like, okay, I'm done. This is the end of music. I'm going to make a band that just sounds like this and elaborates on these ideas. It's just, I can tell that just by listening to it. It's so weird to be like, this is, like, objectively very good, but it doesn't, like, connect with me on an emotional level.
It makes sense. You've shown me things like that. I mean, I think so. So, like, basic ways of understanding what they value. They value sort of clarity, coldness, and remoteness, and sort of extreme minimalism. And the idea that everything is constantly suggesting bigger spaces around it.
Yeah.
This has what Nietzsche would call it an Apolline aesthetic. This is power manifested through reserve, composure, sort of a harmony of form, but in a way that can be very stark and brutal.
I can see that. Yeah, I get that.
And so, and it relates, I think, to this sort of ascetic, occult impulse here, right? This is supposed to be kind of meditative in a way. On the flip side, and one way they achieve that is, like, we could put it, the funny way of putting it is, this band simply isn't, like, not only is this, well, this is not riff-oriented music, right? But when we listened to the Inferno, right? Mm-hmm. That's not riff-oriented music in the way that it's either about these grooves that I was talking about, or, as you were talking about, just these washes of texture that just all blend into each other, right? Mm-hmm. This is not riff-oriented music, and yet it makes you relentlessly focus on the riffs, the melody.
It's
right?
Yeah, it's very.
It's and the riffs, if you evaluate them as riffs, even a couple years ago, if I'd come to this without, I guarantee I would have not given it enough time, and I would have just picked out a sample, and I've been like, wow, these are bad riffs. Like, the band is you'll hear very few things on this that. There are some killer riffs on here, but they're few and far between. And this band seems almost scornful of the idea of trying to write sick riffs. Or even, like, conventional melodies. They're like, what you get here is mostly, like, tropes from Orthodox and Migla guitar that are, like, pared down to their barest essentials. And, not necessarily. Sometimes that can be in this, like, elemental gut punch way, right? Like, here's my Ildjarn riff with two chords, right? But this is much more like a kind of a remote minimalism. So a lot of the sort of difficult pleasures on here or whatever have to do with things like structure. So it's very architectural, structural music. Everything is like stuff in space networking. So let's listen to, like, we both sampled Ciudad de Blood, which means that's an important one, right?
Yeah.
And I think we've got back-to-back samples again. So these are both going to be kind of long. Both going to be kind of long samples. The death metal guy got a really sick, one of the few big climax moments on the record.
I sniff them out like a hog hunting for truffles.
You got them both, and they're both very important. Here, what you're going to hear is the beginning of this sample foreshadows the climax riff that the death metal guy picks. And what's going to link that they're not the same riff, but what you're going to hear is sort of Migla technique, kind of like charming arpeggio with changes in the root that make it sound really epic, basically.
Yeah.
And then you're gonna hear it building. And you're going to think, oh, here we go towards the With Hearts Towards None drop. And then it's going to not do that. So let's follow this and see where it goes.
Yeah, it's funny hearing that again because I thought about sampling the section that you sampled because I was trying to capture the climax, but I didn't realize just how long they do the setup for kind of the climactic part. Because I remember that kind of like whispered spoken word part, which I really liked. One thing
also
worth
the
mentioning.
floor tom with that. Like there was like a floor tom or something that sounds like a shaman drum or something.
Yeah, one thing I gotta give these guys tremendous credit for is they have a better understanding of dynamics than almost anything in black metal. It really reminds me of one time I was at a festival with a lot of like bigger indie bands, and I saw Swans, and seeing Swans, I'm not a huge fan of newer Swans, but the way they played, the very subtle changes in volume and these sort of like dynamic, deeply kind of deep cut, jazzy, musician-y things was really impressive to see executed live. And I think these guys do that really well. And that's something that is very hard to do in extreme metal proper because it's based off of a sort of brick wall of intensity, but these guys really make it happen.
I think that's a very good point. Yeah, there's we really get like decrescendos and crescendos, and they're doing it not by twiddling knobs, but by really finely tuning just the articulation of the playing.
Well, the fact that this has an absurdly expensive production job is part of it.
That's true, and you can see why it took forever. But also they, and I mean, on a practical level, what that just means is that there are really prominent volume spikes, like it will get way louder than you expect it to. And so, yeah, that's a kind of, jazz, classical music-y thing. And another way that's like that is that this whole section, we're inclined to talk about it as a build. And it is because, in some sense, because we know where it's going, right? Because you and I have heard this before, and we know there's going to be a really big part at the end. It has directional movement to it, but it's kind of like classical in that the development is it's like, there are builds in metal, and they're pretty instrumental often. It's like, gotta get us to this part, right? Or even like a pre-chorusy part in a dissection song can be like functional, right? This is part of what you're supposed to listen to. And it's pretty interesting hearing them take that first thing that's like the sort of Migla arpeggios or even post-rock thing, clip off where you expect the build to be, but then the rhythms, and then they start just cycling through different roots, basically. Like, they lower it a lot, and then it gradually starts rising, I think, is the general arc of it. And each new picking pattern is a bit different, but the rhythms are carrying through. And, probably the first time I listened through, I missed that, but at some point I was listening to it, and I heard that, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. And part of the thing is, like, not only is the development supposed to be engaging, but like that first sort of thing that seems like it's the epic build, they stretch that out like very long, and you can hear the drummer accenting it and playing with it in a way that like marks it more as like a thing that you should get into. It's like that buildy part is itself a sound object that's supposed to be like intrinsically enjoyable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no.
The build part at the beginning, the build part at the beginning is actually the closest we get to a hook until your part comes in.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's one place where, getting back to the comparisons between the two bands, this is very similar to Inferno in that they really like using a blend of metallic and non-metallic technique to execute music that is structurally very remote from extreme metal. Because, like, these are not... I say this is more of a black metal record than Inferno is, because, it's got more of the hallmarks of that, but it's weird to describe. Fyrnask is a black metal band that is not really playing black metal songs.
No, I agree.
If that's coherent at all, a thought.
yeah. The general spirit and impulse is there, and like the style of playing music is there, but they do not work as if you expect them to. If you hold these to the criteria of black metal songs, they will not succeed by those criteria. Right? They're sort of aiming at something different.
Definitely. So let's follow up your sample. So we're going to continue right where you left off again, like we did with Inferno. I don't know. There's something in the water today. Mm-hmm. And here is kind of the big climactic moment on this track, which is basically a long Fyrnask's interpretation of a post-black section. Mm-hmm. But here's the first point on the album, at least for me, where the Magla influence really started to come to the forefront. Now, that band would not execute this passage the same way. They would make it snappier. They'd make it poppier. They'd make it more of a hook, where these guys still want to extend that drama even through kind of the big crowd pleaser moment. Mm-hmm. But the essence of like these gloomy goth rock melodies that are going to come in is absolutely something off of Exercises in Futility or Age of Excuse, later Magla. So let's see where it goes from here. It's interesting the way these guys execute the big climax, because it kind of sneaks up on you. We're continuing with that sort of preparatory post-rock. I mean, that's a very almost like Godspeed You Black Emperor thing to do. Just sit on these big crescendos, looping into themselves like a shepherd's tone over and over again. But then, the moment where it all realizes itself is when the drums kick into a steady double kick beat. And then when that happened, I said to you, it's like, there's the Magla right there. That's where it all kind of comes together.
Yes. That's where you can headbang, right? But I feel like Migla totally could do that, and it'd be cool if they did. But I feel like what a lot of listeners would have been expecting there, right, is the shift from the sort of eighth note, sort of, the sort of like staggered 6/8 blast to the sort of like six, or just to the like the subdivided version of it, right, to just a straight up blast beat, right.
Or even just like taking that riff and when the double kick comes in, just turning it into a tremolo stream.
Yeah, even just that, right? So neither of those things happens. And usually, often you'd get both. And so instead of releasing into a blast thing, it releases into this kind of headbangy downbeat thing, but all very crisp. And yeah, so that's what you were saying about the guitars. That's a good point, right? That's not a trem riff. Those are like eighth notes, and they're all being downstroked. And to me, kind of the coolest part of that, I mean, I like the big payoff moment too, but like, to me, the part before it, where you just hear like, the drummer is doing this half blasting with the guitars, and they're like really synced up. This is not at all like a technical record, but it's extremely musician-y, right? And
yeah, you have to be really good at your instruments to make stuff this simple sound the way it does.
Yeah, they're really like when they're just doing those eighth note blasts and the eighth note down picking, they're like, they have a ton of it. To them, it's as if they have like a ton of sonic space to work with, and you can hear them sort of like expanding and contracting each of those pulses. Like the guitars and drum are almost playing a game of like how locked in they can be. Like every downstroke hits with a snare, right? And the snare is not like, it's not an even half blast, right? You're not doing Beharet, right? Each one is like weighted towards where the pick falls. It's
yeah.
It's not like it's not a continuous like da 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 da, da 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 da, right? It's
well, yeah, you need to it's one of those things where it's like you need to be able to play music 10 times as technical as this to be able to play this level of music with that control. Like even just listening to it, like I'm far from a technical guitarist, but I can just listen to the guitar performance on this and be like, okay, this guy just has amazing left-hand tonal control. Like he just, just like perfect, like unwavering fingering on the left hand. Like, the slight, there's, for these guys in this band, there's no room for slight organic variation. No, we want these tones to be exactly the way we want them.
That's true. It's exactly the way you want them, and yet it has this, like, each one of those tones has this very, or that tone that is repeated has this very memorable shape to it. It's got this particular ringing inflection. So, I mean, I think that part is awesome. Also, about the specific shape of the melody, I think I said to the death metal guy when it kicked in, when it kicks in, you don't think that's even going to be the big melody. It seems like a kind of drop out, lurching, funeral doom-esque riff that will take us into something else. But in that moment, you can hear that it really sounds like a Ruins of Everest riff.
Yeah, that's very Ruins.
Yeah, bong, 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 when it's just hit by itself like that.
Yeah, just the incredible space in the cathedral,
Yes, and the other thing about that sort of descending, when it locks into the groove part, especially at the end, that really reminds me of Spire. Whose album we reviewed a few weeks ago, or more than a few
months ago. Yeah. That was towards the beginning of the year. But no, Spire is definitely, that's another record that we both really loved, and had a similar thing to this record where it's using an array of extreme metal techniques to make very not structurally metal music.
You could almost put, I think the first Spire album is really close to this in a lot of ways, but the latest Spire record, which has this kind of, you could almost put that like, it's hard to, even though this is so different from the Inferno, you could actually plot the latest Spire record right between them.
Oh yeah, it would be kind of a gradient in a way.
Because it's got the guitar work and the rhythms are a lot like this. It has a certain kind of like subtlety and restraint. And yet they're also just all these like gut punch heavy metal moments on it, right? It's more, the Spire is more of a metal record than either of these, but like it has that
Spire. Spire is the latest Rush record that nobody has paid attention to.
But it's got sort of it's got reptile brain satisfaction in the way that
it's got big moments,
that the Inferno does,
All right, so to wrap things up, last sample. So we've been sampling a lot of these kind of esoteric moments just because I think that's where the heart of this band kind of lies a lot of the time. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of stuff that we haven't sampled, which is, to a degree, very straightforward black metal. So I sampled one of those moments. This is off a later track called Hellrigen. And so it's not something you hear a lot on this record, but occasionally these guys can whip out just like huge black metal riffs out of nowhere. And it catches you really off guard because so much of the guitar performance on this is very tightly controlled and very delicate in a way that when they, just start ripping out like a really vicious riff, it has kind of an outsized effect. So we're going to listen to a little sample of this, and like the opening riff is like, okay, this is a pretty standard Orthodox figure. I think it's just like, it's like certain grind riffs, everyone has access to these. This is one of those Orthodox riffs that everyone's allowed to have on their album. But then, after that, they get into this like super thrashy kind of Marduk passage that just came out of fucking nowhere on this record. And it was so strong, it made me kind of rethink my whole interpretation of the record. So cool. Let's give that a shot. So yeah, out of nowhere, giant fucking like climactic Marduk riff, and it's like, if it weren't for that like keening, like constant, like super high tremolo on the lead guitar there, that's just like modern Marduk right there, and like one of the best riffs off a modern Marduk record. And it's like, hearing that, I was like, why are we not doing more parts like that? Because like there's moments throughout this record where periodically, we've talked a little bit this year especially about how Orthodox appears to be splitting a little bit into these guys that are going further into abstraction, like Blood Us Nord style, and guys that are getting into a sort of war metal energy with those Orthodox melodic ideas. And this was a moment where they were doing the latter, and I was like, you guys are so good at that. And there's a few more of those dotted around the record. And it's like, those are easily my favorite parts on the album. But then it's like, it's kind of a toss-up. I mean, is it worth, for the band, is it worth sacrificing kind of the breadth of what they're doing for the stuff like that? And I mean, my answer is yes, because I just immediately love that shit. But I mean, for them, probably no. And for most listeners, probably no.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I mean, like, I think, like, yeah, I think for them, it's like, you gotta play up the thing that is most unique about you. However, I wouldn't mind hearing a few more parts like that. I don't know I don't know Forn at all. They're like 2016 record. I think I've checked it out. But anyway, point being, I checked it out because of the pagan vibe, but then it was like kind of orthodoxy sounding, and I was just super not what I was looking for then. So I just, I have only a vague memory of what it sounded like, but I think it sounded more like the blasty stuff. Yeah, I think I really like about that riff. I think the Marduk thing is totally right. Also, though, the way it's being played with this kind of later Marduk does do that kind of droney stuff, or like the kind of octaves or like single string drone thing. But like, the thing it really reminds me of is halfway between Marduk and Migla, which would make it sound like a version of Sulfur Aeon that doesn't make your teeth rot.
Hi, this is Taylor from Crushing the Scepter, and you're listening to Terminus Podcast.
All right, so the death metal guy and I are back from debating the parameters of outlaw rock off air.
As always.
Yeah, to bring you the debut recording, don't know if it's a demo, don't know if it's an EP, who knows these days, by Secret Fire. This is The Old Beast Law, a cool title. And this is out on a new label called Throne of May, if you want the hard copy. Cool tapes. If you want the digital, it is also on Bandcamp. That is, the death metal guy had a very hard time finding it because it's like ungoogleable.
Yeah, I just got a bunch of shit about Lord of the Rings, which I don't know enough about to understand if that's relevant or not.
Yeah, no, there was this Cleveland Holy Terror band called Ascension, who I had their MP3s from the Blogspot days, and then I literally could not find them again after I lost them until they did a reissue like a month ago. Like for years, it's just ungoogleable. Yeah, so this is secretfire.bandcamp.com. Okay, is the base. So, yeah, so this dude's got a, he's got an illustration, he does some like, he does art, and I follow his art account on Instagram. And he's had this project in the wings for a while, I guess. He's done a couple more dark ambient releases on it. But this is the debut of the black metal version of the project. So here the idea is, if with Fyrnask it was kind of, if at the beginning of the show it's kind of, Inferno was sort of Orthodox BM via kind of jammy electronic and sort of krautrock stuff. And at the middle, we had sort of Fyrnask with kind of black orthodoxy, black metal via kind of vast, resonant, dark ambient and whatnot, and sort of post-industrial. Now we're at black metal that's sort of really deriving its mood and a lot of the themes from the more kind of neofolk wing of things. It's got this kind of you could certainly associate it with all the sort of classic bands, the Death in June, the Current 93. Certainly that applies here, and I guess there are deeper cuts I could try for, but Sonhagal, good example. But it's also closely linked. I mean, another thing I really associate this with mood-wise is a band that's been popular lately, which is Monastery, which has this kind of, it's dungeon synth, but like dungeon synth rooted in these sort of deeper, older kinds of electronic stuff. Dungeon synth with a connection to neofolk or industrial music or whatever, and dark ambient. Dungeon synth by somebody who likes electronic music, as opposed to somebody who wanted to start a black metal band but didn't have a guitar. What's cool about Monastery is it has this kind of vibe of like, yeah, some of it's dark, but it really is more about envisioning a pagan future, and in a kind of like benevolent or exciting or beautiful way. And a lot of the music on this has this kind of misty, kind of serene, kind of mystical quest vibe. That is juxtaposed with the title of the record and the cover, which shows a bunch of knights in black armor implementing the old beast law. This is an actual medieval, like, I guess probably wood panel painting of knights putting a bunch of women and children to the sword. So there's definitely an undercurrent of violence here, right? As same with a lot of the neofolk stuff. But it's the main focus of the record is kind of more life affirming and exuberant. So I've got some ideas about what this sounds like. I think this record's kind of a Rorschach test. I can get into it in a bit. What did you just make of all this? Did you like it? Did you?
I liked this more than I expected to. This is one of those cases where I like this so much, I'll be more critical than you usually hear me, because I think there's just small kinks to work out, but if those can be worked out, we'll have like a new like superstar in a way.
No, that makes sense. That's about how I feel about it too.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So, I didn't really look up too much, until I was done listening, and then at the end of it I realized, oh, this is a Canadian project, which is interesting because for some reason I immediately thought this was British. There's something very Anglo-Saxon about this, and I associated some of the melodic ideas with something we were actually talking about off-air, which is Spider God. Some of these really ornate, sort of Victorian flourishing melodies around this core of sort of traditional, like, raw black metal. I think that this is the main guy behind it, because this is like a main guy and some other dudes kind of floating in doing session stuff, right?
Well, it's got a consistent drummer. It's credited to composed, performed, produced, and mixed by Barghest, who's got a sick, very Swordboy Summer picture of himself with a balaclava and some, holly around his head and a fucking claymore. But drums are performed by someone named Izzy Langlais. I haven't I haven't looked up that person on Metal Archives. Maybe I should. Yeah, and maybe a few other session people. But it's basically a one-man project.
But yeah, so I think this guy has a, again, connecting back to Fyrnask, I think this guy has an incredible understanding of how to fold kind of goth rock ideas into black metal without resorting to goth rock parts, you know? Mm-hmm. Which I think is very important, because I think, you know, it's funny, you know, talking about, black metal folding in goth rock. I mean, they've been doing that the whole time. I mean, going back to something like Forgotten Woods, obviously, that is, like, half fucking Fields of the Nephilim at the end of the day. But, at the same time, it's like, you know, we're in a new phase of metal right now. You know, we've exited the age of Aquarius, so to speak. And I think that there's a lot of, like, stuff starting now in a new form. Just in, like, the year that we've been doing this podcast. And I think one of those is, like, how do we fold goth rock fully into black metal? And, you know, the initial phase of that is just having goth rock parts in your black metal song, which is, obviously, it's going to be novelty fun for people, but then, you know, the real step comes in. How do we fully integrate these things? And there's a couple ways to do that. Like, the first episode of this year, I brought on that Vergeblikite record, which fused goth rock and black metal in a very unusual, very interesting way. But now, this guy, I feel, is doing that in a way where we can really move forward with it. It's like, how do we take the lessons of goth rock guitar technique and fully incorporate them into black metal? But the other thing that this has, along with all the all the high-minded stuff, is it's just got, like, big heavy metal moments, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Those are sort of it's like those are like a pedal point he returns to throughout. They're like touchstones.
Yeah.
Like,
and I mean, like, a big thing for me was I was surprised that you didn't say it, because I think Graveland is all over this.
I didn't really hear that. Yeah.
Graveland.
Looked, after you said that, I looked for it and I could hear the really sick power chord blast riff at the end of the record. Definitely is a little bit Gravelandy, but I guess really more in the sense that Graveland is raw pagan music wrapped around a sort of fundamental heavy metal core. You know, I guess I don't hear Graveland as very heavy metal-y.
That's interesting, because I hear it as very heavy metal.
Maybe some of the stuff on Following the Voice of Blood, which is the one I played for you, you know, or the one we did the bonus episode on, because that has some of these very kind of bang your head moments on it.
Well, I mean, what about later stuff like Creed of Iron or something like that? That's got big fucking epic heavy metal moments, I feel.
Yeah, to a certain extent, but structurally it's really different. Like Fire Chariot of Destruction certainly will, like, scratch metal itches, right? You can headbang to it. It's got really big sound. The concept of epic there, his concept of epic clearly owes something to Manowar. Right?
Yeah, I was thinking
epic battle.
Graveland, Manowar by way of Graveland, I think, is a big thing. But additionally, you know, apart from Graveland, something I came back to
something
a lot,
you could say is Solstice in terms of the heavy metal parts, and in terms of the general mood of this album. And that's the Manowar thing goes into Solstice. It's in terms of the mood of this album, Solstice is New Dark Age. This kind of, like, you know, somewhat dark and sword-filled, but kind of exuberant vision of the Middle Ages.
And then another thing that I wanted to touch on, you know, apart from the Graveland, was Winterfilleth, who have, I think, sort of accidentally become very important in black metal. Now, obviously, we've definitely got differing opinions about Winterfilleth at various phases, but I think we could probably both agree that they've become subtly influential to a lot of black metal, especially on kind of the melodic and somewhat pagan side. Would you agree?
Definitely. So, like, as far as I get that this album definitely has a bit of an English feel to it, in the Solstice-y way, in the Death in June-y way, in the just in all kinds of the sort of neo-medievalist reference points. His label is Throne of May, right? Tapping into those ideas about like May Day festivals or whatever. He's got like William Blake art on the label page. That all makes sense to me. Winterfilleth, I don't know if I heard in particular, but definitely like filtered ideas of Slavic black metal. The thing it really reminds me of, like uncannily reminds me of, is House of First Light. Like, I don't know whether he was listening to that stuff at all. Like, as far as I can tell from his Instagram, he like listens to Darkthrone a lot. Like, but like specifically, so the I don't know, like specifically, to some degree, maybe some of the better known stuff like Sanguine Eagle or whatever, but more like Will Skarstad's projects like Yellow Eyes or Ustalost or Imperial Trumpet. All of which have this kind of gothy arpeggio-based guitar, but not quite in the way that is, a little weirder sounding than you'd expect. Strange harmonies, and a kind of feeling of deliberate disorientation that you also get on Lamb's stuff, right? And that you got especially with that old... One of the originary bands of that scene was Vord, when their specific concept of it was like goth black metal. And it had these gothy arpeggio things, but like really crazy sounding. And with this atmosphere of pursuing this atmosphere of confusion, which I think is big on this record. And I think my samples, like my first sample focuses on that. But maybe we should, it's late in the night, we're talking.
Yeah, we should probably actually talk about music. Okay.
Yeah.
So both of us took samples off the two of the same tracks, which is interesting. I don't think we've ever done that before. It's like 4 samples off 2 songs. And they're basically adjoining sample. Oh, no, the second one isn't, but close enough. So the first one, this is like 3 main tracks and an intro. We're going to go with the first main track. This is called Mercurial Hammer. And coming from me, this is going to be a pretty long sample, but I think it's important to hear how these guys really develop melodies over the course of pretty long sections of time. And there's just a lot of wonderful stuff to talk about this. I'll shut up and let's listen to some Mercurial Hammer, was interesting while we were talking, you know, because like this is like you said up front, it's kind of a Rorschach test because like one of those big riffs really scanned to me as super Winterfilleth, and you said not at all with the way they were harmonizing. It was very House of First Light to you, and then my thing is, well, you know, House of First Light is usually so intensely Slavic in origin, and I don't really hear that so much here. So it's very interesting the different perspectives we have on the same piece.
Well, Winterfilleth is also intensely Slavic in origin. I mean, the common root there would be Druidk, and Druidk has more sophisticated chords than Winterfilleth, right? You get that kind of, you get like big dense chords, you get weird shit like, I don't know, sevenths and stuff in there. I don't know.
Yeah, but at the same time,
that's beyond my comprehension.
Well, House of First Light, though, usually wouldn't do, like, a giant double kick drop. Like these guys do.
No, they do. They do. The end of this, the giant double kick drop reminds me of, like, the payoff parts in the last Sanguine Eagle records.
Oh, okay. I can see
it's
that.
It's like, they're just very deferred, but they also, like, have this moment. Like, this guy throws in, yeah, we got one of those big heavy metal riffs at the end. That was sick. He throws them in more, but those sort of nods to like big heavy metal moments do happen on House of First Light records. Yeah. But again, like I mean, you're familiar with Yellow Eyes, right? You probably know them better than me, maybe.
I know Yellow Eyes a little bit through like an internet friend, and I've checked it out, and it's like it was interesting the description because what I heard of Yellow Eyes, and this would have been years ago, so maybe they've changed. I remember it as being like pretty arty and dissonant in a way. Which is not something I get from this at all.
Well, weird Druid chords. And weird Druid chords kind of floating around away from the tonal centers you usually expect in this stuff. And I hear that very much throughout this. I think there's a lot of like chromaticism in this guy's writing. It's just not in any given riff. All the individual riffs are pretty like classically melodic. But I can get into it with my sample. What else did you want to say?
Yeah. Well, so just a couple quick notes. So one, I love the clean vocal stuff here. That's outstanding. And I love that the way they come across, they're big, clean vocal passages, but they are not they're not executed in a heavy metal way necessarily. But the effect they have is undoubtedly super heavy metal in the context of the music, which I think is very cool. I mean,
bro, you know where those are from, right? It's the Bergtat. It's like it's the beginning of Bergtat. Yeah,
I always listen. I just listen to Nottin's Madrigal. So
all right, it's so these big Gregorian. But that is another big influence here is that for that Ulver record, and it's a weird record because I was talking about this with Bullgod. It's a weird record because it's very difficult to be influenced by it. Anything you can take that specifically evokes that record almost evokes it too much. And so usually when you get vocals like that, you can think, oh, they're doing the Ulver thing. So like a band that did that, an example, a good example of this was Kaivum did it. Like on just this mega brutal like black metal record, they just threw in the Ulver vocals at the end, and it was pretty cool. A bad version of this would be what's fucking Mirker. She literally patterns a song on one of those Bergtat songs down to the same sort of cascading Gregorian chant vocal. But this guy sort of gets closer than anyone I've heard to taking some of the ideas from Bergtat and just making them using them as his own kind of vocabulary. Like, because even just in the most dumb basic sense of like there are other parts that sound like this on the record, you know what I mean? Like like just the like the Gregorian chant vocals, they come back and they have different shapes to them.
Yeah, no, I think it's beautiful, and you know me, I'm very picky when it comes to clean vocals in extreme metal, but he fucking absolutely kills it here. And then the last point before we move on, this is going to be one of my kind of critical things structurally. Do we need that middle break where everything fades out? Because I think it would be more powerful if he excised some of that stuff and just immediately go into that next triumphant riff. I kind of like the idea of, oh, what if we did this music but totally non-stop? Totally just fucking 100% all the time. Leave behind all the sort of, like, traditional mores of good songwriting or tasteful songwriting, and it's just fucking continuous from first to last.
Maybe something like that. It's definitely telling that, like, I think we basically just, in terms of our sample, we basically just clipped out the dropout in the middle.
Oh, no, there was a dropout during my sample, but there's another kind of pseudo dropout between these two, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think those dropouts are they're very important to the aesthetic he's going for, but you're right that they're, like, I feel like part of this music, it's supposed to be mysterious, it's supposed to be disorienting, is a word I'll keep coming back to with this.
Yeah.
And in that sense, I get why he's doing it, but I agree, there are legitimate questions to ask about how exactly do you execute this vision. I think this is a band where the vision is crystal clear to him. And you and I can both basically also see it. Like, the whole is there. This guy started with the whole. The parts need some refining. And then once the parts are refined, the whole will become even clearer. But
Yes.
So here's a sample that speaks to that, then, in another way. It's exactly the same concern you're getting at, but in a little different way. So, this is just, so, okay, we're going to come back in that, basically in heavy metal land, in that 6/8 chug thing again. But then it's going to release into this more airy stuff, and we're going to get into, when I talk about that kind of suspended or hovering or floating feel, I think you'll hear what I mean. And
Okay.
that, yeah. Sick drop, bro. And so, there's a moment where I very much agree with you about sort of just doing the more, going for the more sort of forthright, less mannered approach, and just, like, let us hear more of that really sick part instead of fading it out. But, the atmospheric stuff on the rest of the track is cool, but you could just delay it by a minute and have that minute filled by rocking out with that fucking sick solo. But what the part that's interesting is the part before then, where it kind of takes off. And so first is a thing about the riffing, right? Is that I think the overall principle in the riffing is, like, it's highly chromatic. Not in the sense that there are a bunch of ugly half steps, right? like every phrase kind of fits into a major or minor scale and has something to do with riff forms we know. But like, if you think about but often they're falling on, he's got this dense web of like, I don't know, like, you know better than me, chorused out guitar and probably synth in the background marking the chords.
Yeah. There's something like that, yeah. He's
often playing to the weirdest or highest tension intervals in the chord. Things like that. He'll like, so like a riff like da 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 da, you know, that's all in key, but it doesn't really kind of jumping around in a weird way. It's not, the riffs don't seem to like lock in around root notes, strong tones, or like even lock into sort of traditional melodic shapes, whether those are coming from metal riffs or from folk or classical or any of these other references, or goth.
No, I agree. Because I think that's something you hit on that I think is my big question about this music, which is, on one hand, the sort of diffuse nature of these songs is what makes them special. That is the personality of this band.
Yeah.
At the same time, by doing that, he walks this tightrope of, and I would say for the most part, he sticks it. I think for the majority of the time he pulls it off, but like there's like a moment on that sample where you can hear it's like, ooh, they're not really sure where this is going. Right
you heard it too. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, you mark it in the notes where they kick back into the blast, and he's still floating with that same sort of, like you said, in key but very strange sort of arrangement. And it's like, you know, there was supposed to be something else there.
There's like 5 or 6 notes after it, and in those 5 or 6 notes, this isn't, it sounds like we're getting really autistic about this because we are, right? But
because we like this so much.
Yeah, we don't want to, like, obviously it's, as a critic, you don't want to second guess the artist on a minute level, but like,
well, we're speak for yourself. That's my favorite thing.
but basically, like, yeah, you can just hear a moment where the guitar melody like gets kind of lost, and it's like a thing you hear in post-black songs often. Is like there's a glistening tremolo melody that's kind of searching for where it's supposed to go. But the thing is, constantly is like all the architecture of this is so damn solid that, like, you get to this meandering, diffuse moment, and then you hear where it's going. It is going someplace, and you get that massive drop, right?
Yeah.
It's just a matter of how exactly is that being filled in. And, like, some of that airy, diffuse, wandering quality you really want. And it's like, how do you make this music mystic quest and wander without, like, getting lost or going down a weird sort of side path that just leads to, some trolls, and not the trolls you're looking for.
I think you're pretty much, like, on the money about all of it. I think the ultimate question really does come down to, maintaining this very delicate balance and, kind of deciding, in a way, what direction this is going to go. Because this is a guy who can do... He's kind of between a rock and a hard place. Because when you're doing melodies that mostly refuse to do traditional, for lack of a better term, epic black heavy metal melodies, which are foundational to a lot of the things that we enjoy. When you refuse to do that, that's fine, and that's respectable. But it means you kind of need to have, like, twice as many riffs as you ordinarily do. And this guy has twice as many riffs. There's so much going on in these fucking songs. But it also means that walking that tightrope, if you slip a little bit, or one riff doesn't really stick where it needs to, I guess what I'm saying is he's taken this very punishing path to writing this kind of music.
Well said. Yes, he's set himself a challenge.
He set himself a serious challenge, because I know there's ways to write these songs in ways that are easier and more immediately pleasing, and would probably get him on a pretty big black metal label very quickly, just with the chops that he has, But he's taking a very hard path instead, and that comes with its own problems.
Yeah, so it's really just a matter of, like, some of these problems still need some working out. I mean, you can hear that the method is something like, the method is something like outside, inside, diffuse and airy, locked more in. And, like, you hear it at that big heavy metal riff at the end or on the death metal guy's sample, right? He can lock in around a tonal center. He can give you just a sick, charging Dorian scale pedal point chug riff, right? He can do the swords riffs. The
swords riffs. Yeah, I know what you mean, but it's fun.
Yeah. But the first part of the record really definitely accentuates this kind of wandering, misty stuff. So the ultimate question is, okay, can he pull out some barnstorming, sort of vicious trem riffs? And actually the answer is yes. So let's go to the beginning of Sunshaft Apparition, which I think you and I would probably agree is, like, pound for pound.
That's the best song.
It's and this is where the whole idea seems to be. There's some sort of narrative going on in the whole record, I think. And this is like, okay, here's the black metal song. So let's go to about 50 seconds into this. Gorgeous Baroque violin melody, go burr.
This is funny. This is one of the most French-sounding passages on an album that doesn't actually have a lot of them.
Yeah, I could hear that. It's definitely consistent with the French mood. It sounds like the melody really reminds me of just Vivaldi, like something on like the Four Seasons or something. Like definitely Southern European. And it's got like it's not, and like that kind of riff is just not super. A French band could write it, right? But that's that's a weird riff. It's oriented around leads. It achieves a kind of hypnotic repetition through these little kind of arpeggios, the but it's got two lines crossing each other. Like, could you hear that? The sort of counterpoint on that is just like really cool.
Oh yeah, no, it's
like,
a wonderful passage.
Like the beginning of the riff, the guitar that's in the foreground at the beginning of the riff becomes the harmony part on the second part of it. It's like, like a helix or something. It's really just that. See, like, and also like for so much of the record, right, he's like rejecting traditional melody forms, right? Rejecting the kind of like way that black metal melodies will talk to metal or classical or whatever. There you get like, oh, here's a melody that has the kind of traditional quality that taps into deep history in the way like the great black metal trem riffs are supposed to. So that's fucking cool. I mean, also, a cool thing is that there's a kind of way that riff has a kind of, I think, ties in nicely to the album's ethos, which is, this record's a little bit difficult. You can't place it at any one point in time. There's no, like, it's not themed on any era or something, right? There's, like, you get these Gregorian chant vocals that are kind of medieval. You get persistent just medieval vibes, right? Then you get this kind of, like, more Baroque or classical sounding thing. And you get, and the sense of tonality here is consistently very modern and kind of weird, right? So, that relates to this idea of, this guy seems like a real occultist whose basic frameworks are pagan, but not in the sense of like, I'm trying to I'm not in the sense of like asatru, right? Or on the goofier side, not in the sense of, as you memed, practicing asatru by drinking a horn at Vagan. This is more sort of like, right, paganism as a sort of living tradition that continues after the nominal death of paganism, right? So there's all this medieval stuff here, and I searched for the quote. I just wanted to include it here. It was on the Throne of May Instagram. It's right. Of course, I ADHD'd my way off the page. Now we're back. Throne of May is an artist magician-run label dedicated to a unified vision of an archaic future. It is our quest to put out music that inspires our contemporaries and supports the ongoing rebirth of mystical awareness within the modern world.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah.
Oh, so that's just. Are you sure you didn't write that? Is this your project, Black Metal Guy?
Exactly. It's rare I've heard something that I'm just like, yeah, like it's rare I've heard something that I've vibed with so much on like an ideological level for sure. Yeah. So I've spurged about that enough. Let's go to your sample.
Okay, my sample. Comes towards the end of Sunshift Apparition, and for my lead-in, I will say, haha, big Magla arpeggio go bing bang boom bong. And it's pretty fucking sick. This is the giant climax at the end of the record, so let's do it.
Cool.
we got a couple of big French stonkers on that part, don't we?
Yeah. That first riff has the da 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 da. The sort of turnaround on the end of that's super French, right?
It's like the most convoluted Seigneur Volant riff in the world.
Yeah.
But then there's that big arpeggio thing that's 100% Migla to me.
It could be, especially on the latest Migla, but it's also like really. I should have found it's probably lazy of me not to find a sample for it, but it really is a Yellow Eyes Vord kind of thing. Like it's like weird and they were doing that at about when, like Vord was doing that right when with Hearts Towards None came out, like 2012. Okay. But like, yes, it could be Migla. I mean, does he like Migla? I mean, we all like Migla. So it's entirely possible he doesn't listen to House of First Light at all, and he's like, yeah, man, I just like Migla. But like, that's a that kind of, even the tone, like the kind of like raw chiming guitar tone, and the kind of just weird, like those intervals, right? They're all kind of too weird to be Fields of the Nephilim intervals, right? Like kind of like somewhat uncomfortable like arpeggios, but like, yeah, it works also like a big Migla thing. And then I mean, how many sick riffs are in that passage?
How many sick riffs are on this record?